The morning sun filtered through the grand windows of Kensington Palace as Catherine Middleton sat in her private sitting room, her hands trembling slightly as she held the official document. The Royal Protocol Manual lay open before her, its pages filled with centuries-old traditions that had governed the British royal family for generations. She had read this particular section dozens of times, yet today the words seemed to burn into her consciousness with unusual intensity. The rule was clear and uncompromising. No member of the royal family should ever publicly express personal political opinions or take sides in matters of public controversy. It was a fundamental principle that had protected the monarchy's neutrality for hundreds of years. Catherine understood this deeply, having spent years learning the intricate web of expectations that came with her position as the Princess of Wales. But today was different. Today, she had received information that made her question everything she had been taught about royal duty versus personal conscience. The letter from Sarah, a young mother from Manchester, still lay beside her teacup. The woman's desperate words echoed in Catherine's mind as she recalled the heartbreaking story of how government cuts to mental health services had left her teenage son without the support he desperately needed. Catherine's own advocacy work had brought her into contact with countless families struggling with similar challenges. She had visited hospitals, attended charity events, and met with organizations working tirelessly to support mental health initiatives. Through these experiences, she had witnessed firsthand the devastating impact of inadequate funding and resources on vulnerable communities across the United Kingdom. The princess closed her eyes and remembered the faces of the children she had met during her recent visit to a youth mental health center in Birmingham. Their stories of struggle, hope, and resilience had touched her deeply. She thought about James, a 16-year-old who had waited 8 months for therapy after a suicide attempt. She remembered Emma, whose eating disorder had gone untreated for over a year due to service shortages. These were not statistics or political talking points to Catherine. They were real people whose lives hung in the balance. William had noticed her growing distress over these issues. During their private conversations, he had seen how deeply affected she was by the stories of suffering she encountered through her charitable work. He had watched her struggle with the traditional royal approach of offering comfort and support while remaining carefully neutral on the underlying policy issues that created these problems in the first place. The invitation to speak at the National Mental Health Summit next week sat on her desk, marked with the royal seal. It was meant to be a standard appearance, the kind she had made hundreds of times before. She would smile, offer encouraging words, perhaps share a carefully crafted anecdote about the importance of mental health awareness, and avoid any mention of the systemic issues that perpetuated the crisis. But Catherine found herself unable to accept this limitation any longer. The weight of unspoken truths pressed down on her as she considered the platform she would have at the summit. Hundreds of healthcare professionals, policymakers, and advocates would be in attendance. The media coverage would be extensive. She would have an opportunity to speak directly to those who had the power to create meaningful change. Her personal secretary, Amanda, knocked gently on the door before entering with the morning's correspondence. Catherine noticed the concerned expression on the older woman's face as she placed the stack of letters on the mahogany desk. Amanda had served the royal family for over 20 years and had developed an intuitive understanding of the delicate balance required in royal communications. The two women had developed a close working relationship built on trust and mutual respect. Amanda had guided Catherine through numerous challenging situations, always ensuring that her public statements remained within the carefully defined boundaries of royal protocol. Today, however, Amanda sensed something different in the princess's demeanor. Catherine stood and walked to the window, gazing out at the carefully manicured gardens where her children often played. The sight of the playground equipment reminded her of her role not just as a princess, but as a mother who wanted to ensure a better world for the next generation. She thought about Charlotte and Louis, and how the mental health services they might one day need were being systematically undermined by political decisions disguised as economic necessity. The internal conflict raged within her as she weighed her personal convictions against her royal obligations. She had always been praised for her ability to navigate royal duties with grace and diplomacy. The press had consistently portrayed her as the perfect royal bride who had seamlessly adapted to her role within the institution. But perfection in royal terms often meant silence in the face of injustice. Catherine picked up her phone and scrolled through the messages from various mental health organizations. Each one painted a similar picture of overwhelmed services, desperate families, and young people falling through the cracks of an inadequate system. The statistics were staggering, but it was the personal stories that truly haunted her. Behind every number was a human being whose life could be saved or lost based on the availability of timely, appropriate care. She remembered her conversation with Dr. Elizabeth Harper, a child psychiatrist who had worked in the National Health Service for over 30 years. Dr. Harper had described the heartbreaking reality of having to turn away children in crisis due to lack of resources. The experienced physician had broken down in tears as she recounted the story of a young boy who had taken his own life while waiting for an appointment that never came. These memories crystallized Catherine's resolve. She realized that her position of privilege and influence came with responsibilities that extended beyond traditional royal duties. The protection of vulnerable people, especially children, surely outweighed concerns about political neutrality. Her conscience would not allow her to remain silent when she had the power to potentially save lives through her words and actions. As the morning progressed, Catherine found herself drafting notes for what could be the most important speech of her life. She wrote about the moral imperative to protect the most vulnerable members of society. She crafted arguments about the economic benefits of early intervention in mental health care. She gathered statistics about suicide rates, treatment waiting times, and the long-term costs of inadequate mental health services. The speech she envisioned would not attack any political party directly, but it would make clear her position that current funding levels were insufficient to meet the needs of the population. She would call for increased investment, improved access to services, and a national commitment to treating mental health with the same urgency and resources devoted to physical health conditions. Catherine understood that such a speech would inevitably be interpreted as political commentary. It would likely generate controversy and criticism from those who believed she had overstepped her role as a member of the royal family. The political implications were significant, as mental health funding had become a contentious issue in recent parliamentary debates. Yet as she considered the potential consequences of speaking out, Catherine also thought about the consequences of remaining silent. How many more children would suffer needlessly while she maintained her careful neutrality? How many families would be destroyed by a system that failed to provide adequate care for its most vulnerable citizens? The weight of inaction felt heavier than the risk of breaking protocol. The afternoon brought a scheduled meeting with her private secretary and communications team to review the draft remarks for the Mental Health Summit. Catherine sat at the head of the conference table, surrounded by advisors who had dedicated their careers to protecting the reputation and interests of the royal family. Their expertise in navigating complex political landscapes was invaluable, but today Catherine sensed their advice would conflict with her growing determination to speak truth to power. As the meeting began, Catherine felt the full weight of the decision before her. She could continue following the safe path that had served the monarchy well for generations, or she could risk everything to stand up for principles that transcended political considerations. The hesitation she felt was not about whether she believed in her cause, but about whether she was prepared to face the consequences of defying one of the most sacred rules of royal life. The conference room fell silent as Catherine's communications director, James Morrison, finished reading through the preliminary speech draft. His years of experience managing royal public relations had taught him to recognize potential controversies before they erupted into public scandals. The document before him represented exactly the kind of risk he had been hired to prevent. James looked up from the papers, his expression carefully neutral despite the alarm bells ringing in his mind. The other team members shifted uncomfortably in their chairs, each recognizing the unprecedented nature of what the princess was proposing. Never in recent memory had a senior royal made such direct policy criticisms while remaining within the institution. Catherine watched their faces carefully, reading the concern and professional anxiety written across their features. She had worked with this team for years and respected their expertise, but she also understood that their primary loyalty was to the stability and reputation of the monarchy rather than to any particular cause or principle. Amanda cleared her throat delicately before speaking. She had served as the bridge between Catherine's personal convictions and royal expectations countless times before, but this situation presented unprecedented challenges. The careful diplomatic language that usually resolved such conflicts seemed inadequate when faced with Catherine's determination to address what she saw as a moral crisis. The discussion that followed revealed the depth of the challenge Catherine faced. James outlined the potential political ramifications of her proposed remarks, explaining how different political parties would likely interpret and respond to her statements. Opposition leaders would almost certainly accuse her of partisan interference, while government supporters might feel betrayed by what they would perceive as criticism of their policies. Catherine listened to these concerns with growing frustration. She understood the political sensitivities involved, but she struggled to accept that protecting the monarchy's reputation should take precedence over advocating for children's lives. The abstract concept of constitutional neutrality seemed less important than the concrete reality of young people suffering due to inadequate mental health services. Dr. Rebecca Shaw, Catherine's advisor on charitable affairs, presented a different perspective. She had spent decades working in the nonprofit sector before joining the royal household, and her experience had taught her the importance of strategic communication in achieving policy goals. Dr. Shaw suggested that Catherine could achieve her objectives through more traditional royal advocacy methods. The alternative approach would involve increased patronage of mental health organizations, more frequent visits to facilities struggling with underfunding, and carefully worded public statements that highlighted problems without explicitly criticizing government policy. This strategy would allow Catherine to maintain her political neutrality while still drawing attention to the issues that concerned her. Catherine appreciated the thoughtfulness of Dr. Shaw's suggestions, but she questioned whether such incremental approaches would create the sense of urgency needed to address the current crisis. She had been following traditional advocacy methods for years, and while they had achieved some positive results, the fundamental problems persisted and seemed to be worsening. The meeting continued for over 2 hours as the team explored various compromises and alternatives. They discussed the possibility of working behind the scenes with government officials, leveraging Catherine's relationships with key policymakers to advocate for increased funding through private channels. They considered organizing a series of roundtable discussions that would bring together experts and officials without requiring Catherine to take public positions on controversial issues. Each suggestion had merit, but Catherine found herself increasingly convinced that the situation demanded more direct action. The family she had met through her charitable work couldn't wait for gradual progress achieved through diplomatic channels. The children currently struggling with mental health crises needed immediate attention and resources, not another series of carefully orchestrated meetings and photo opportunities. As the afternoon wore on, Catherine began to realize that her internal conflict reflected a broader tension within the modern monarchy. The institution had survived for centuries by adapting to changing circumstances while maintaining its essential character and functions. However, the pace of social and political change in the 21st century created new challenges for an institution built on tradition and continuity. Catherine's position as a modern woman with strong personal convictions sometimes clashed with her role as a representative of an ancient institution. She had entered the royal family with her own experiences, education, and moral framework, but she was expected to subordinate these individual characteristics to the larger requirements of monarchy. The princess found herself questioning whether the traditional approach to royal neutrality remained viable in an era of rapid social media communication and intense public scrutiny. The expectation that royals would remain silent on important issues while maintaining extensive charitable patronages seemed increasingly artificial and potentially hypocritical. During a brief recess in the meeting, Catherine stepped onto the terrace outside her office. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the palace grounds as she contemplated the decision before her. She thought about the public's evolving expectations of the royal family, and whether absolute political neutrality truly served the best interests of either the monarchy or the nation. Public opinion polls consistently showed that younger generations expected public figures, including royals, to take stands on important social issues. The idea that someone with Catherine's platform and influence should remain silent about matters affecting children's welfare seemed increasingly anachronistic to many observers. Catherine also considered the international context of her potential decision. Royal families around the world were grappling with similar questions about their roles in addressing contemporary social challenges. Some had embraced more active advocacy roles, while others maintained strict adherence to traditional neutrality. The British monarchy's approach would likely influence these global conversations about the evolving nature of constitutional monarchy. When the meeting reconvened, Catherine presented her team with a modified proposal. Instead of delivering a speech that directly criticized government policy, she would focus on sharing the personal stories of families affected by inadequate mental health services. She would use her platform to amplify voices that might otherwise go unheard, allowing the experiences of real people to speak for themselves. This approach would still generate political controversy, as the stories themselves would implicitly critique existing policies. However, Catherine argued that sharing factual accounts of people's experiences represented a legitimate use of her platform that fell within acceptable bounds of royal advocacy. James remained skeptical about this compromise, warning that the media would inevitably frame such a speech in political terms regardless of Catherine's intentions. He explained how sound bites and quotes would be extracted from their context and used to support various political arguments. The princess's words would become ammunition in parliamentary debates and campaign advertisements, whether she intended this outcome or not. Catherine acknowledged these risks, but argued that the potential for misinterpretation should not prevent her from using her voice to advocate for vulnerable people. She pointed out that virtually any substantive statement about social issues carried some risk of political interpretation, but this shouldn't render the royal family completely ineffective in addressing societal problems. The debate within her advisory team reflected broader questions about the role of privilege and platform in addressing social injustice. Catherine's unique position gave her access to policymakers, media attention, and public influence that most advocates could only dream of having. The question was whether her royal status obligated her to use these advantages responsibly, even if it meant challenging traditional constraints. Dr. Shaw suggested that Catherine consider consulting with other members of the royal family before making her final decision. The princess had developed close relationships with several family members who had navigated similar challenges in balancing personal convictions with institutional requirements. Their experiences and perspectives might provide valuable guidance. Catherine agreed to these consultations, but she also made clear that her ultimate decision would be based on her own assessment of her moral obligations rather than institutional pressures. She respected the wisdom and experience of senior family members, but she believed that each royal had to find their own way of serving the public interest within their constitutional role. As the meeting concluded, Catherine felt a strange mixture of anxiety and clarity. The path ahead remained uncertain, but her commitment to advocacy had crystallized through hours of discussion and debate. She understood the risks involved in challenging traditional protocols, but she also recognized that meaningful change often required individuals to step beyond their comfort zones and accepted roles. The evening brought private reflection time as Catherine reviewed her notes and considered the various perspectives presented by her advisors. She appreciated their expertise and dedication, but she also recognized that their primary responsibility was to protect institutional interests rather than to champion particular causes. The final decision about how to balance these competing priorities would ultimately rest with her alone. Catherine spent the night thinking about the legacy she wanted to leave and the example she hoped to set for her children. She considered whether history would judge her more harshly for speaking out on behalf of vulnerable people or for remaining silent in the face of preventable suffering. The weight of her position had never felt more substantial than it did as she prepared to make a decision that could reshape her role within the royal family and her relationship with the British public. The following morning brought an unexpected call that would further complicate Catherine's already difficult decision. Dr. Michael Thompson, the chief executive of the Children's Mental Health Alliance, contacted her office with urgent news about a developing crisis in Yorkshire. A 13-year-old girl named Sophie had attempted suicide after waiting 6 months for psychiatric care, and her story was beginning to attract media attention. Catherine listened with growing dismay as Dr. Thompson described Sophie's situation. The young girl had been referred for treatment after experiencing severe depression following her parents' divorce, but budget cuts had reduced the local mental health service to a skeleton staff. Sophie's name had been placed on a waiting list that grew longer each week as more children needed help and fewer resources became available. The tragedy had been preventable with timely intervention, according to the medical professionals involved in Sophie's case. Early treatment could have provided Sophie with coping strategies and support systems that might have prevented her crisis from escalating to such a dangerous level. Instead, she had been left to struggle alone with overwhelming emotions and psychological pain that no child should have to endure. Dr. Thompson explained that Sophie's family had agreed to share their story publicly in hopes of preventing other families from experiencing similar tragedies. They wanted to speak at the upcoming Mental Health Summit, believing that their personal testimony might finally prompt the decisive action that advocacy groups had been requesting for years. Catherine felt a surge of emotion as she considered Sophie's story alongside her own deliberations about breaking royal protocol. Here was a real child whose life had been endangered by the very system failures that Catherine's proposed speech would address. The abstract policy debate suddenly became intensely personal and immediate. The princess arranged to meet privately with Sophie's mother, Helen, later that week. The conversation took place in a small conference room at the hospital where Sophie was receiving treatment. Helen's exhaustion and anguish were evident as she described the months of bureaucratic obstacles and delayed appointments that had preceded her daughter's crisis. Helen spoke with quiet anger about the countless phone calls to various agencies, the forms that disappeared into administrative systems, and the repeated assurances that help would come soon. She had watched her daughter deteriorate while navigating a maze of underfunded services and overworked professionals who wanted to help but lacked the resources to provide adequate care. Catherine found herself deeply moved by Helen's determination to transform her family's tragedy into advocacy for systemic change. The mother's courage in speaking publicly about such a private and painful experience demonstrated the kind of moral leadership that Catherine admired and aspired to emulate. During their conversation, Helen looked directly at Catherine and said something that would haunt the princess for weeks afterward. She told Catherine that public figures with platforms and influence had a moral obligation to speak out when children's lives were at stake. Helen's words carried no criticism or pressure, but they reflected an expectation that those with power would use it responsibly to protect the vulnerable. Catherine left the hospital with a profound sense of clarity about her own responsibilities. Sophie's story had transformed her theoretical concerns about mental health policy into an urgent moral imperative. The question was no longer whether she should risk controversy by speaking out, but whether she could justify remaining silent while children suffered. That evening, Catherine had a lengthy conversation with William about her growing conviction that she needed to break with traditional royal neutrality. William listened carefully as she described her meeting with Helen and her deepening understanding of the crisis facing young people across the country. He had watched Catherine's passion for mental health advocacy grow over the years and had seen how deeply affected she was by the stories of struggle she encountered. William's response reflected both his love for his wife and his understanding of the institutional pressures she faced. He supported her desire to advocate more forcefully for children's mental health, but he also worried about the potential consequences for her position within the royal family and their children's future roles. The couple discussed the precedents set by other members of their family who had challenged conventional expectations in pursuit of causes they believed in. They considered how Diana's advocacy work had sometimes created tension with traditional royal protocols, but had ultimately enhanced her legacy and the monarchy's connection with contemporary social issues. Catherine and William also talked about the changing nature of public expectations regarding the royal family's role in addressing social problems. They recognized that younger generations increasingly expected public figures to take stands on important issues rather than maintaining careful neutrality on matters affecting people's lives. The conversation helped Catherine clarify her thinking about the relationship between her personal convictions and her royal duties. She came to understand that authentic service to the British people might sometimes require challenging traditional constraints rather than simply accepting them as immutable features of royal life. Over the next few days, Catherine began consulting with trusted advisors outside her official royal household. She spoke with mental health professionals, child advocates, and policy experts who could provide perspective on the potential impact of high-profile advocacy on government decision-making processes. These conversations revealed encouraging evidence that royal intervention in policy debates could indeed influence outcomes when handled strategically. Historical examples showed that carefully timed and well-articulated royal statements had sometimes helped build public consensus around important social issues and had encouraged political leaders to reconsider their positions. Dr. Sarah Martinez, a prominent child psychiatrist and policy researcher, explained to Catherine how public awareness campaigns led by respected figures could create political pressure for legislative action. She described how celebrity advocacy had helped secure increased funding for various social programs in recent years, and she suggested that Catherine's unique position could amplify these effects significantly. Catherine also reached out to international contacts who had experience with royal advocacy in other constitutional monarchies. A confidential conversation with a Scandinavian princess who had successfully championed children's rights reforms provided valuable insights into strategies for maintaining royal dignity while engaging in substantive policy advocacy. These international examples demonstrated that constitutional monarchies could adapt to include more active royal involvement in addressing social issues without undermining their fundamental constitutional roles. The key seemed to be focusing on moral and humanitarian arguments rather than partisan political positions, and maintaining consistency with established royal values and priorities. As Catherine gathered this information, she began drafting a more sophisticated version of her proposed speech. She incorporated lessons learned from successful advocacy campaigns while maintaining her focus on the human stories that had originally motivated her desire to speak out. The new draft balanced policy critique with constructive suggestions and avoided language that could be easily characterized as partisan attack. The revised speech centered on Sophie's story and similar cases that illustrated systemic failures in mental health care delivery. Catherine planned to argue that protecting children's welfare transcended political considerations and that adequate mental health services represented a fundamental societal obligation rather than a discretionary policy choice. She would call for increased investment in mental health services while acknowledging the budget constraints facing government officials. The speech would emphasize prevention and early intervention as cost-effective approaches that could reduce long-term public expenses while saving lives. Catherine hoped this framing would appeal to both humanitarian and fiscal concerns. The princess also decided to announce a new royal foundation dedicated specifically to children's mental health advocacy. This initiative would provide a concrete mechanism for channeling public attention into sustained policy reform efforts. The foundation would work with existing organizations while maintaining royal independence and credibility. As the date for the Mental Health Summit approached, Catherine felt a growing sense of anticipation mixed with apprehension. She had committed herself to a path that would likely generate significant controversy and criticism. The conservative media would almost certainly accuse her of inappropriate political interference, while supporters might expect her to take even stronger positions on related issues. Catherine understood that her decision would establish a precedent that could influence how future royals approach their own advocacy work. She felt the weight of responsibility not only for the immediate impact of her speech, but also for the longer-term evolution of the monarchy's role in addressing contemporary social challenges. The final preparations for her speech took place against a backdrop of mounting public interest in the Mental Health Summit. News outlets had begun reporting on the agenda and speakers, including speculation about Catherine's planned remarks. The royal communications team worked overtime to manage media inquiries while avoiding premature disclosure of the speech's content. Catherine spent her final evening of preparation reading through testimonials from families affected by mental health service shortages. These stories reinforced her conviction that speaking out was not only appropriate, but necessary. The faces and voices of struggling children and desperate parents had become her motivation for accepting the risks associated with challenging traditional royal constraints. As she finalized her speech notes, Catherine reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment of decision. She had evolved from a dutiful royal following established protocols to an advocate willing to use her position to champion vulnerable people's needs. The transformation felt both natural and revolutionary as she prepared to step onto a stage that would test the boundaries of contemporary royal influence. The morning of the National Mental Health Summit arrived with unprecedented media attention. News vans lined the streets outside the conference center as journalists from around the world gathered to cover what many anticipated would be a historic moment for the British royal family. Catherine's communications team had managed to maintain secrecy about the specific content of her speech, but rumors and speculation had created an atmosphere of intense expectation. Catherine woke before dawn, unable to sleep as the magnitude of her decision weighed heavily on her mind. She spent the early morning hours reviewing her speech one final time, making small adjustments to ensure that every word conveyed her intended message with precision and clarity. The document represented months of careful thought and preparation, but she knew that the public's interpretation might diverge significantly from her intentions. The princess's morning routine included a private moment of reflection in her sitting room, where she looked at photographs of the children and families she had met through her charitable work. Their faces reminded her of why she had chosen to risk controversy by speaking out. Sophie's photograph held a place of honor among these images, serving as a constant reminder of the human cost of policy failures and bureaucratic indifference. William joined Catherine for breakfast, offering quiet support and encouragement as she prepared for what they both knew could be a defining moment in her public career. They discussed their children's schedules and normal family matters, maintaining a sense of normalcy despite the extraordinary circumstances surrounding the day's events. The conversation turned to the potential long-term implications of Catherine's decision. They acknowledged that her speech might permanently alter her relationship with government officials and could complicate future royal engagements with political leaders. However, they also recognized that staying true to her convictions might ultimately strengthen her credibility and effectiveness as an advocate for important causes. Catherine's security detail arrived earlier than usual, reflecting the heightened public interest in her appearance at the summit. The drive to the conference center provided time for final mental preparation as she watched the city pass by outside her car window. She thought about the ordinary families going about their daily routines, many of whom were struggling with mental health challenges that inadequate public services had failed to address. Upon arriving at the venue, Catherine was struck by the energy and anticipation that filled the building. Mental health professionals, advocates, and policymakers had traveled from across the United Kingdom to attend the summit. Many had been working for years to address the systemic problems that Catherine planned to highlight in her speech, and they sensed that her royal platform might finally provide the amplification their message needed. Dr. Thompson greeted Catherine personally, expressing his gratitude for her willingness to use her position to advocate for vulnerable children. He introduced her to several other speakers, including family members who would be sharing their personal experiences with mental health service failures. Catherine found their courage and determination inspiring as she prepared to add her own voice to their advocacy efforts. The morning sessions focused on technical aspects of mental health policy, including budget allocations, service delivery models, and outcome measurements. Catherine listened intently to these presentations, taking notes that would help her contextualize her own remarks within the broader policy discussion. The statistics and expert analyses confirmed her understanding of the crisis while providing additional evidence to support her arguments. During a brief break between sessions, Catherine had an unexpected encounter with Margaret Richardson, a senior civil servant from the Department of Health. Margaret approached the princess with obvious nervousness, requesting a private word about the afternoon's proceedings. Their conversation took place in a small anteroom away from the main conference activities. Margaret's message was diplomatically phrased but unmistakably clear. Government officials were concerned about reports suggesting that Catherine's speech might include criticism of current mental health funding levels. The civil servant emphasized the importance of royal neutrality in policy debates and suggested that the princess might consider focusing her remarks on general advocacy themes rather than specific policy critiques. Catherine listened politely to Margaret's concerns while maintaining her commitment to delivering the speech she had prepared. She explained that her remarks would focus on sharing the experiences of affected families rather than making partisan political arguments. However, she made clear that she would not avoid discussing the real-world consequences of inadequate funding and support services. The exchange with Margaret reinforced Catherine's understanding of the political sensitivities surrounding her decision. Government officials clearly understood that her speech could influence public opinion and create pressure for policy changes. Their attempt to discourage her from speaking out confirmed her belief that royal advocacy could indeed make a meaningful difference in policy debates. Lunchtime brought a gathering of summit participants in the main reception hall. Catherine mingled with attendees, listening to their stories and perspectives on mental health challenges facing young people. She met teachers who described students struggling without adequate support, healthcare workers overwhelmed by growing demand, and parents desperate for help that remained frustratingly out of reach. These conversations reinforced Catherine's conviction that her decision to speak out was morally justified regardless of the political complications it might create. The human suffering caused by policy failures seemed far more important than concerns about royal protocol violations. She felt a growing sense of responsibility to use her privileged position to amplify voices that might otherwise go unheard by policymakers. Helen, Sophie's mother, approached Catherine during the lunch reception. The two women had developed a strong connection through their shared commitment to preventing other families from experiencing similar tragedies. Helen expressed her gratitude for Catherine's willingness to risk controversy by addressing systemic problems that had endangered her daughter's life. Their conversation provided Catherine with final confirmation that her decision was the right one. Helen's perspective as a mother who had nearly lost her child to preventable circumstances carried more weight than any number of protocol concerns or political considerations. Catherine understood that her primary obligation was to the vulnerable people she had pledged to serve rather than to institutional traditions that might prevent her from serving them effectively. As the afternoon session began, Catherine took her place on the main stage alongside other keynote speakers. The auditorium was packed with conference participants, and she could see television cameras positioned throughout the hall. She knew that her words would be broadcast live and analyzed extensively in the hours and days that followed. The introduction preceding Catherine's speech emphasized her years of advocacy work and her deep commitment to mental health issues. The conference organizers had deliberately avoided mentioning the controversy surrounding her planned remarks, but the anticipation in the room was palpable as attendees realized they might be witnessing a historic moment. Catherine approached the podium with a mixture of nervousness and determination. She looked out at the audience and saw faces representing every aspect of the mental health system, from frontline workers to senior policymakers. She thought about Sophie, Helen, and all the other families whose stories had brought her to this moment of decision. The princess began her speech by acknowledging the dedicated professionals in the audience who worked tirelessly to support young people facing mental health challenges. She expressed her admiration for their commitment and recognized the difficult circumstances under which they operated. This opening established her respect for the people working within the system while setting up her critique of the systemic failures that hindered their efforts. Catherine then transitioned to sharing Sophie's story, describing the months of delay and bureaucratic obstacles that had preceded the young girl's crisis. She spoke with emotional intensity about the preventable nature of Sophie's tragedy and the countless other children facing similar risks due to inadequate services and support systems. The audience listened in rapt attention as Catherine detailed the human cost of policy decisions that treated mental health as a lower priority than other healthcare needs. She described her meetings with families who had navigated impossible choices between seeking help for their children and managing overwhelming waiting lists and service gaps. As Catherine continued her speech, she began to address the broader policy implications of these individual stories. She argued that protecting children's welfare transcended political considerations and that society had a fundamental obligation to provide adequate mental health services regardless of budget constraints or political priorities. The princess called for increased investment in mental health services while acknowledging the complex budget considerations facing government officials. She emphasized prevention and early intervention as both humanitarian imperatives and cost-effective policy approaches that could reduce long-term public expenses while saving lives. Catherine's speech built to a crescendo as she announced the establishment of a new royal foundation dedicated specifically to children's mental health advocacy. She explained that this initiative would work to bridge the gap between policy rhetoric and practical implementation, ensuring that vulnerable young people receive the support they needed and deserved. The response to Catherine's speech was immediate and electric. The audience erupted in sustained applause that lasted for several minutes, with many participants rising to their feet in appreciation of her courage and commitment. The energy in the room suggested that her words had resonated powerfully with people who had been working for years to address the same problems she had highlighted. As Catherine left the stage, she knew that she had crossed a line that would forever change her role within the royal family. She had deliberately chosen to prioritize her advocacy for vulnerable children over traditional constraints on royal political expression. The consequences of this decision would unfold in the hours and days ahead, but she felt a deep sense of satisfaction at having used her platform to speak truth about issues that mattered profoundly to the people she served. The aftermath of Catherine's speech unfolded with stunning rapidity as news outlets across the globe scrambled to analyze and interpret her unprecedented breach of royal protocol. Within hours of her appearance at the Mental Health Summit, headlines dominated television screens and newspaper front pages worldwide. The story had captured international attention as a defining moment in the evolution of modern monarchy. The immediate response from conference participants had been overwhelmingly positive, with mental health advocates and healthcare professionals praising Catherine's courage in addressing systemic failures that they had been highlighting for years. Social media platforms exploded with messages of support from ordinary citizens who shared their own stories of struggling to access mental health services for themselves or family members. However, the political establishment's reaction was swift and sharply divided. Conservative members of parliament issued strongly worded statements criticizing what they characterized as inappropriate royal interference in government policy. They argued that Catherine had violated fundamental constitutional principles by taking sides in partisan political debates about public spending priorities and service delivery models. Opposition politicians, while generally supportive of Catherine's advocacy for increased mental health funding, expressed concern about the precedent her speech might establish for future royal involvement in policy controversies. Several prominent figures warned that the monarchy's long-term stability could be endangered if members of the royal family began regularly taking public positions on contentious political issues. The government's official response came through a carefully crafted statement from the Prime Minister's office. The message acknowledged Catherine's good intentions and her genuine concern for vulnerable young people, but it also emphasized the importance of maintaining constitutional separation between royal advocacy and political decision-making processes. Behind closed doors, senior government officials were reportedly furious about what they viewed as a coordinated assault on their mental health policies. Emergency meetings were convened to develop strategies for responding to the public pressure that Catherine's speech had generated. The princess had succeeded in making mental health funding a front-page political issue, exactly as her critics had feared. The royal family's internal reaction to Catherine's decision created additional complications. Senior family members who had spent decades carefully maintaining political neutrality were concerned about the precedent her speech had established. Private conversations within palace walls reflected deep divisions about whether Catherine's advocacy represented an evolution of royal responsibility or a dangerous departure from established practice. The queen consort, Camilla, was among those who expressed private support for Catherine's decision to prioritize child welfare over protocol concerns. Having developed her own passion for domestic violence advocacy, Camilla understood the frustration of wanting to speak more forcefully about issues that affected vulnerable people's lives. However, other family members worried that Catherine's breach of tradition could encourage similar departures from established practice by other royals. They feared that the monarchy could lose its carefully maintained position above political controversy if individual members began regularly taking sides on contentious policy issues. Prince William faced particular scrutiny as speculation mounted about his own views regarding his wife's controversial speech. Public statements from his office emphasized his support for Catherine's mental health advocacy while avoiding direct comment on the political implications of her remarks. This delicate balancing act reflected the complex position he occupied as both a supportive husband and a future king. Media coverage of the controversy continued to intensify throughout the week following Catherine's speech. Television programs featured extensive debates between constitutional experts, political commentators, and royal historians about the appropriate limits of royal political expression. The discussions revealed fundamental disagreements about the monarchy's role in contemporary British society. International media outlets treated the story as a significant development in the evolution of modern constitutional monarchy. European newspapers drew comparisons to other royal families that had embraced more active advocacy roles, while American media focused on Catherine's personal courage in challenging traditional constraints. The story's global reach was amplified by social media platforms where ordinary citizens from around the world shared their own experiences with mental health service failures. Catherine's speech had sparked an international conversation about government responsibilities to provide adequate mental health care, extending far beyond the specific British policy context she had addressed. Public opinion polling conducted in the days after the speech revealed complex and sometimes contradictory reactions among British citizens. Large majorities expressed support for Catherine's advocacy on behalf of mental health services, but significant numbers also worried about royal involvement in political controversies. Generational differences were particularly stark, with younger respondents overwhelmingly supporting Catherine's willingness to speak out on important social issues. Older citizens were more likely to express concern about departures from traditional royal neutrality, though even among this demographic, substantial minorities praised her courage and moral leadership. The most significant long-term impact of Catherine's decision began to emerge as government officials found themselves under unprecedented pressure to address the mental health service failures she had highlighted. Parliament announced plans for emergency sessions to review current funding levels and service delivery models, acknowledging that public attention had created political imperatives for rapid action. Mental health advocacy organizations reported dramatic increases in public engagement and support following Catherine's speech. Donation levels surged as ordinary citizens sought ways to contribute to addressing the problems she had described. Volunteer applications to mental health charities increased substantially as people looked for concrete ways to help vulnerable young people in their communities. Sophie's family, whose story had inspired Catherine's decision to speak out, expressed gratitude for the princess's courage in using her platform to prevent other children from experiencing similar crises. Helen, Sophie's mother, became a prominent advocate in her own right as media attention focused on her family's experience with systemic failures. The therapeutic benefits for Sophie herself proved to be an unexpected positive outcome of the controversy. The intensive media coverage had resulted in her receiving immediate access to specialized care from leading mental health professionals who volunteered their services. Her recovery became a powerful symbol of what could be achieved when adequate resources were made available. Within royal circles, Catherine's decision gradually gained acceptance as family members recognized the positive public response to her advocacy. The initial shock and concern about protocol violations gave way to acknowledgement that her speech had enhanced rather than damaged the monarchy's reputation among younger generations. The establishment of Catherine's new mental health foundation proceeded rapidly as donations and offers of support poured in from around the world. The organization quickly became one of the most well-funded and influential advocacy groups in the sector, providing Catherine with a powerful platform for continued engagement with policy issues. Government policy changes began to emerge within months of Catherine's speech as political pressure mounted for concrete responses to the problems she had identified. Emergency funding was allocated to reduce waiting lists for children's mental health services, and new legislative proposals were introduced to strengthen service delivery standards. These policy victories validated Catherine's belief that royal advocacy could create meaningful change when focused on moral rather than partisan considerations. The success of her approach encouraged other members of the royal family to consider more active engagement with social issues that aligned with their personal convictions and charitable interests. Constitutional experts began to develop new frameworks for understanding appropriate royal involvement in policy advocacy. These evolving guidelines recognized that modern monarchies could maintain their essential neutrality while allowing individual royals to champion humanitarian causes that transcended partisan political divisions. Catherine's decision to defy traditional protocol ultimately strengthened rather than weakened her position within the royal family and British society. Her willingness to risk controversy for the sake of vulnerable children enhanced her credibility as an authentic advocate rather than merely a ceremonial figure following scripted protocols. The long-term legacy of Catherine's courageous speech continued to unfold as mental health services improved across the United Kingdom. Her decision to prioritize moral leadership over institutional traditions had created lasting positive change for countless families, while establishing new possibilities for meaningful royal engagement with contemporary social challenges. Years later, as Catherine looked back on her decision to speak out at the Mental Health Summit, she felt deep satisfaction at having chosen conscience over convention. Sophie's recovery and the policy improvements that followed demonstrated that sometimes the most important rule to follow is the obligation to protect vulnerable people, regardless of the personal or institutional costs involved. The controversy that had initially seemed so threatening had ultimately enhanced both Catherine's individual effectiveness and the monarchy's relevance to modern British society. Her hesitation had given way to decisive action that honored both her royal responsibilities and her personal convictions, proving that authentic leadership sometimes requires the courage to challenge even the most sacred traditions.